We just racked up our brand new 2018 Jeep JL Wrangler Rubicon Unlimited, and I went ahead and took off the front skid plate or air dam so that we could get a better look at what's underneath it in terms of suspension and steering components. So we're going to go over a few of the things that we see right off the bat. These are the things that you'll be working with in the future if you're going to do a suspension lift or make modifications to your steering. So let's go over some of the basics. First off, we've got a 4-link suspension system with a track bar. So if you look back here first, this is the track bar for the JL. And as you can see, it's actually much bigger, much beefier than what we had on the JK. You can see it's got these forged endings that tie into the frame here and onto the axle on the passenger side. Next, we're going to talk about the drag link. The drag link is actually what's tied into the pitman arm and the steering box and allows you to steer your vehicle around. This up here is your pitman arm, and it's tied into your steering box, which is now made out of aluminum. And this heavy-duty bar right here, this is your drag link, which is now a tube again, and it's got a single adjuster as opposed to a turnbuckle like we used to see on the JKs. Looks much bigger, much more heavy-duty. Of course, in order to make it all work, we have the drag link tied into the all-new steering knuckles, which are made out of aluminum now. And you can see that they're larger and beefier, kind of like what you see on the new Pro 1550s made by Dynatrac. And to make everything steer together, both passenger and driver side tires, you have to have a tie rod. This tie rod is also tied into these new aluminum knuckles and goes all the way over to the driver side knuckle. And as you can see, it's much bigger, much beefier than what we had on the JK as well. Much like we have on the drag link, we just have a single adjuster on here, once again, on the driver's side. Unlike the JK, which had a steering stabilizer that was connected to the track bar mount and then to the tie rod using a clamp, the JL has a steering stabilizer that's physically connected to the axle just past the FAD unit and then comes all the way down and secures into the tie rod end, as you can see here. Moving away from the steering components, we're now going to talk about some of the suspension components, and the first one we'll address is the sway bar. The front sway bar, as you can see right here, is tied into this large silver box, this electronic unit. This is actually the electronic sway bar disconnect that all Rubicons come with. Really nice feature to have. All the Jeep vehicles, regardless if you have a Rubicon Sport or Sahara, if you don't even have this electronic sway bar disconnect, the front sway bar is going to be tied into your front axle using these sway bar end links, as you can see right here. These are located both on the driver's side and passenger side of your Jeep, and they physically tie in to your axle. Being that the Jeep JL Wrangler is still a solid axle design, both front and rear, and held together by a 4-link suspension system, you can see here that this is the front lower control arm and this is the front upper control arm. Typically, the lower control arm sets the position of the axle, whereas the upper control arms, if it's adjustable, would actually control where your caster setting would be. As is the case with any 4-link suspension system, this Jeep has coil springs, which you can see are right here, and these are the shock absorbers. And this yellow thing that you see here, this is the jounce stop, or the bump stop, sometimes people call it. And you can see there's a coil isolator now that the JLs come with on the lower spring perch. One of the interesting new features on the Jeep JL Wrangler is this box right here. This is called the FAD, or the front axle disconnect. It's designed to help save gas, kind of like locking hubs, but not exactly. Even though the 3.6 liter motor that you find on the JL is very similar to what you find on the JK, you can see here that the oil pan is physically smaller and even sits higher up. Now, while protection is warranted for it, a bigger reason to add a skid plate in this area is to protect these guys, these transmission cooler lines that are really exposed. Much like the JK before, the JL still has a very similar Arzepa style front drive shaft, which has a U-joint at the pinion, but a CV joint at the transfer case. One of the nice new benefits that they have, though, is they redesigned the exhaust crossover so that at a full droop, this plastic slip shaft boot no longer comes into contact with it and gets destroyed. You will notice, though, there is still an exhaust loop on this vehicle, and it's just to help an even amount of exhaust to come out all at the same time. Just like we saw up front, the rear drive shaft on the JL is very similar to what we saw on the JK and has an Arzepa style CV joint on the pinion and on the output shaft, as you can see here. In spite of what some people seem to think, the factory gas tank skid plate is actually really tough. On the JL, they've actually made some improvements over the JK by adding some of the structural embossing or ribbing to give it more strength. Another cool feature that I've noticed about the gas tank skid plate on the JL is that it now has a profiling to it that allows for greater clearance of the pinion. One of the nice things about purchasing a JL with a 3.6 liter motor like we did is that there's no longer an evap canister on the belly to get hit by rocks. Looking at the rear end of the JL, you could see that the track bar, just like the front, has been redesigned, still beefier than before, and you can see it's got this new bracket on the rear axle that positions it higher up as well. It's much beefier material all the way around, and you can see how it ties in. Once again, this is a solid axle that's being held together by a 4-link suspension system. Here you can see the rear lower control arm, and right here you can see the rear upper control arm as well. Just like the front, the rear lower control arms will set the position of the axle, and the rear upper control arms will set the pinion. Here you have the rear coils, which have a new lower spring isolator of some sort. And these would be the shock absorbers for the rear axle, still tied into the lower control arm mounts, just like the JK, but unlike before, it's now mounted on the outside of the frame rail and up here, as you can see. Just like the front end, you have a rear sway bar that's attached to the axle to help stabilize the rear end. And finally, just like the front end, we have a jound stop, this rubber puck that's tied into the frame, or the bump stop, that helps limit upward travel as well. Last but not least, I'd like to point out the axles that come on the JL Rubicons. Unlike the JK Rubicons before, which had Dana 44s front and rear, the JL Rubicons now have a brand new M210 front axle and an M220 rear axle. Now, what's cool about these axles is that they're about 68 inches wide, and that's about 2.5 inches wider than the JKs before. Also, in addition to having beefed up brackets all the way around, the M210 front axle now has significantly bigger end forgings, or axle seats as most people like to call them, and axle tubes that are about 2 3/4 of an inch in diameter. So that was a quick peek underneath our Jeep JL Wrangler Rubicon Unlimited with a 3.6 liter motor. Now if you'd like to see more detailed photos of everything you just saw, all you need to do is click on this link right here. Now if you're not already a member, we'd love for you to come by jlwrangler.com and become a part of our online community. Thanks for watching, and we look forward to seeing you again here on the JL Journal.